In the Middle Ages, killing a man in battle was expected, encouraged, even praised. But there was one weapon so terrifying, so efficient, so utterly merciless, that the church itself tried to erase it from war. Not regulate it, not control it, ban it. This weapon shattered the rules of combat. It made knights obsolete. It turned peasants into executioners. And when it appeared on European battlefields, the old world began to die. This is the story of the crossbow. The weapon medieval Europe feared so much, it was declared a sin to use. A world built on honor. Until it wasn't, to understand why the crossbow was banned, we must first understand medieval warfare. For centuries, war was governed by class, knights trained from childhood. Armor was expensive. Swords were symbols of status. Battle followed unwritten rules. Skill mattered. Courage mattered. Lineage mattered. Victory belonged to those born into power. Then the crossbow arrived, and none of that mattered anymore. A simple weapon with unthinkable power. The crossbow was brutally simple. A short bow mounted horizontally on a wooden stock. A trigger mechanism, a steel bolt. No lifetime of training, no mastery of archery. A farmer could learn to use it in days, and with a single pull of the trigger, he could kill a knight. Steel versus steel, and steel lost. Unlike traditional bows, the crossbow fired short, heavy bolts with immense penetrating power. Early medieval armor, chainmail, padded gambesons, even early plate, was suddenly vulnerable. Contemporary accounts describe bolts, piercing mail, cracking shields, punching through helmets. Knights, once nearly untouchable on the battlefield, began to fall like common soldiers. Not in glorious duels, but instantly, silently, from a distance. Why this terrified Europe? This was not just a military problem. It was a social apocalypse. The medieval world was built on hierarchy. The crossbow didn't care who you were. A noble died the same as a peasant. And that was unforgivable. The church steps in 1139, at the Second Lateran Council, the Catholic Church made an unprecedented declaration. The use of the crossbow against Christians was forbidden. The wording was chilling. We forbid under anathema that murderous art of crossbowmen and archers be employed against Christians and Catholics. This was not symbolism. It was a direct attempt to remove a weapon from European warfare. Why? Because it worked too well. A weapon called unchristian. The Church argued the crossbow violated natural law. It allowed killing without honor, without struggle, without warning. One chronicler wrote that it allowed cowards to kill the brave. In a society obsessed with valor, this was blasphemy. Where the Vikings enter the story. By the time of the ban, the Viking Age was fading, but the Norse world remained deeply involved in European warfare. Norse mercenaries served in Norman armies, Byzantine forces, European courts. The Normans, descendants of Vikings, were among the earliest adopters of the crossbow. At the Battle of Hastings, 1066, Norman crossbowmen may have helped bring down Anglo-Saxon shield walls. The weapon spread through the same trade routes, battlefields, and mercenary networks the Vikings once dominated. The irony of the ban. The ban failed completely. Kings ignored it. Armies expanded crossbow units. Fortifications adapted. Why? Because banning the crossbow did not make war more moral. It only made losing more likely. Because once this weapon appeared, there was no going back. The terror of the crossbow was not just what it did. It was how easily it did it. This was not a weapon of finesse. It was a machine built for killing. And once it appeared on the battlefield, warfare would never be the same again. The mechanism that changed everything. At its core, the crossbow was revolutionary. Unlike a longbow, which required years of physical conditioning and perfect technique, the crossbow transferred power into mechanics. A rigid bow, often made of steel, a locking nut, a trigger. The shooter did not need strength. He needed only patience. Early crossbows were cocked using foot stirrups, belt hooks, windlasses, and cranks. This allowed draw weights far beyond what a human could manage with a hand-drawn bow. The result? Unmatched penetrating force. The bolt, short, heavy, and merciless. Crossbow ammunition, called bolts or quarrels, was designed for one purpose: to kill armored men. Shorter than arrows, thicker shafts, hardened steel heads. Many were shaped specifically to split chainmail rings or punch through padded armor. Contemporary battlefield reports describe bolts embedded through shields, into torsos, clean through limbs. Unlike arrows, bolts rarely lodged shallow. They ended fights instantly. Why armor stopped mattering for centuries? Armor had been a solution. Chainmail dispersed slashing blows. Helmets deflected swords. Shields absorbed arrows. The crossbow ignored all of that. At close to medium range, a steel-prodded crossbow could penetrate. Mail hauberks, gambesons, even early plate. A knight could spend a fortune on protection and still die from a single unseen shot. The psychological weapon. Crossbows did more than kill bodies. They killed confidence. Knights who once rode fearlessly into battle now advanced cautiously. Shields raised, visors lowered. They knew death could come. From behind walls, from forests, from unseen hands. There was no duel, no warning, just impact, the democratization of death. This was the true crime of the crossbow. It leveled the battlefield. A trained knight and a poorly fed peasant now stood equal, if the peasant held a crossbow. Training time dropped from decades to weeks. This terrified the ruling class, because power was no longer inherited, it was loaded. Crossbowmen as a new soldier class. By the 11th and 12th centuries, professional crossbow units appeared across Europe. Cities like Genoa became famous for elite crossbowmen. These soldiers fought from behind pavises, large shields, in defensive formations. On castle walls, they could halt cavalry charges, something previously unthinkable. The Viking world and adoption. In the late Viking Age, Norse descendants, particularly the Normans, embraced the crossbow eagerly. Why? Because Viking warfare had always valued practical lethality over ritual honor. If a weapon worked, it was used. The Normans carried this philosophy into medieval Europe. Efficiency over tradition. Results over ceremony. Why the ban failed, the church could condemn the crossbow. But kings needed it. Castles needed it. And enemies used it. Once one army adopted the crossbow, everyone else had to follow, or die. Morality does not survive long against effectiveness. The church spoke, and Europe ignored it. Because on the battlefield, survival mattered more than salvation. The crossbow was not just still in use after the ban, it became essential. The ban that meant nothing. The 1139 ban forbade crossbows against Christians. Not pagans, not Muslims, not heretics, and even then, enforcement was nearly impossible. No army disbanded its crossbowmen. No king dismantled his arsenals. The weapon was simply too valuable. The death of a king. In 1199, King Richard I of England, known as Richard the Lionheart, was struck by a crossbow bolt during a siege in France. The wound became infected. Richard died days later. One of the greatest warrior kings in Europe, killed by the very weapon the church tried to erase. This was not an accident of history. It was a warning. Siege warfare. the crossbow's true domain. While devastating in open battle, the crossbow truly dominated siege warfare. Defenders behind walls could remain protected, take careful aim, reload safely. Attackers advancing under fire suffered horrific casualties. Castle warfare became slower, bloodier, more technological. The end of the charge. For centuries, a knight's charge decided battles. Armor gleamed, horses thundered, lances shattered lines. The crossbow changed that. A single well-placed bolt could kill. The horse, the rider, or both cavalry could no longer advance without fear. The age of invincibility was over. Crossbowmen become hunted. Crossbowmen knew they would not be spared. Captured archers were often executed, maimed, blinded. They were seen as dishonorable killers, not warriors, but they kept fighting because they were winning. The irony of chivalry knights condemned crossbows as cowardly, then hired crossbowmen. They cursed the weapon, then demanded it. Honor did not survive contact with reality. The Viking legacy continues. The Normans, descendants of Vikings, were among the first to fully integrate crossbows into combined arms warfare. Their success spread the weapon across Europe. Viking pragmatism lived on, not in longships, but in steel bolts. The crossbow was never truly defeated. It was replaced, but before it vanished from the spotlight, it reshaped the world forever. Forcing armor to evolve. As crossbow bolts tore through chainmail, armor had to change. Knights added thicker padding, reinforced plates, curved steel to deflect impact. This arms race led to the rise of full-plate armor in the 14th and 15th centuries. But protection came at a cost. Weight increased, mobility decreased, expense skyrocketed. Only the richest could afford to survive. A temporary solution. Even plate armor was not invincible. At close range, heavy crossbows, especially those with steel prods and windlass cranks, could still penetrate vulnerable points. Visors, joints, underarms. No armor could fully escape physics. The crossbow opens the door to gunpowder. The crossbow normalized a terrifying idea. Skill no longer mattered as much as technology. Once that door opened, it could not be closed. Gunpowder weapons followed the same logic. Minimal training, massive lethality, psychological dominance. The firearm did not end chivalry. The crossbow weakened it first. Why the Church really feared it. The Church did not fear the crossbow because it was cruel. War had always been cruel. They feared it because it removed moral hierarchy. It allowed death without ritual, victory without virtue, power without birthright. It exposed a truth no institution wanted acknowledged. Violence favors efficiency, not honor. The ban as a symbol. The ban was never enforceable. It was symbolic, a desperate attempt to preserve a world already collapsing. And like all attempts to stop technological change, it failed. From Viking pragmatism to modern war, the Vikings believed in one rule of combat. If it works, use it. The crossbow embodied that philosophy. No poetry, no ceremony, just results. That mindset still defines warfare today. The final verdict. The crossbow was not evil. It was not cursed. It was not unholy. It was honest. It revealed what war truly is, a contest of efficiency, fear, and survival. And that is why it was banned. The Vikings did not invent the crossbow, but their world embraced it. And once it arrived, the age of knights was already dying. If you enjoyed uncovering the weapons that reshaped history, then you're already standing at the edge of a much darker past. Subscribe for more true stories of forgotten wars, forbidden weapons, and the brutal truths history tried to bury. Because history isn't written by heroes. It's written by what survives.